Hi, I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. Hello, hello, hello. Thanks for joining us this week on Should Have Listened to My Mother. Here we are in the middle of season 3 already, a new show every week. And I totally want to thank my listeners out in California in the Ventura area listening to 104.1 FM on KPPQLP. I appreciate all ears on deck for Should Have Listened to My Mother. You can also stream it on the MyTuner app and on capsmedia.org/radio. So thank you, everybody, East and West Coast, all around the world, because we do have listeners. It's so much fun to say we do have listeners all around the world. Another guest for today, and this was interesting how I found this story, but we'll get into that as soon as I introduce Irina. We've just spoken briefly right before we started this show, so I don't really know what we have on the docket for today, where it's going to go, but I'm sure it's going to be quite fascinating. The guests I've had on this show are, sometimes I consider them very brave. They're willing to share these stories, these personal stories. Each story is unique, but often we can see or hear this common thread woven amongst these mother-son, mother-daughter relationships. And what I often hear is the expression, they did the best they could with what they had. And sometimes that really irks me, it bugs me, it really pisses me off, but it is true. And that said, especially when I receive a response from a potential guest mentioning the divorce from their mother or that their mother is narcissistic, my first response as an empath is that my heart aches for them. And then I look for that glimmer of hope that may be there, of someone special, that one special person in their life that truly was present for them. And then I go a little further or I get a little bit more of the story and I see and hear the word grandmother. My grandmother was a huge and regular influence in my life. Irina Lester, owner of the local yarn store in South Orange, New Jersey, wrote just that. And here to share stories of the maternal figures in her life is the mom of 3 children. Irina, welcome to Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you again for having me on the show. I'm very excited to be here.
Often I inquire if someone might be interested in doing an interview and they immediately no way, there's so much stuff going on in that department that they want nothing to do with it. And then some people are great. Like I said, we all have these unique stories, and by airing it, it's I think it lifts it out of the dark shadows sometimes. So again, thank you for coming on board. So you did mention you have a biological mom and you have a grandmother. So how about we start a little bit about your biological mom?
So I was actually born in Russia, which is where my mother grew up her entire life until the age of 25. I came to America when I was 2.5. So I've been here my entire life. I'm 40, almost 47. So it's, significantly longer here than there. We came to America as Jewish refugees because Russia didn't really want it to hang on to its Jews at that point anymore. While I wouldn't say that my mother was a particularly religious, well, she wasn't a religious person at all. She certainly did define herself by what she perceived as the injustices of being Jewish in Russia. And so it didn't help that it was very difficult for anyone to be successful at anything, during Soviet Russia. And so she was one of 3 children. They did not have a lot of money. My grandmother was a seamstress, her mother. My grandfather was a tailor. And she always wanted more. than what was available. And so when her father died very young, he was 45, and there were some complications after he'd had surgery for a brain tumor. That just sort of compounded her personal narrative, even at that age of 14. And so she became even more solidly who she was when I, you know, got to know her as a child. And the stories in, from my aunt, her sister, who's older, always have to do with how, even as a small child, if she had gotten her hands on extra money, like coins or whatever, she would never tell anyone. She would go out and she would get a thing for herself that made her happy, even though the entire family was struggling. And my aunt took jobs as early as possible so she could, help feed everyone and keep everybody afloat. And my grandmother made all of their clothes out of fabric leftovers for, from customer orders that she'd gotten. So, you said in the very beginning of the show that people say of their mothers, she did the best that she could. And, I think I'm with you. That statement makes me very unhappy and certainly sometimes angry, because I'm a mother and I've been very poor and alone with a child because I was divorced. And, I think that there's always better that you can do. I don't think that circumstance is enough of a validation for not being a present and loving parent. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers. I think I got away from your question a little bit, but that's her history. In a not a nutshell, but succinctly.
So you got this feeling from your mom, like when you figured out what she was really all about. Were you a teenager or was it as an adult?
It was earlier. I honestly, I'd always, I there's, so my mother, as a narcissist, and mind you, she's never been formally diagnosed as a narcissist, but much research has confirmed and validated my realization as an adult that would be her diagnosis, were she actually seen by someone and diagnosed. My mother was she kind of ruled the roost, and my father, who was absolutely besotted with her and worked all the time to, he was a mechanic and he worked till 3 a.m. sometimes, and she was always difficult to be with, and I didn't know why that was. She always seemed exhausted and by me specifically. She seemed very exhausted by me. I was a pretty undemanding child as far as children go, I think. I think my demands were pretty natural biological demands. And there was a survival skill that I think developed. I don't know how much of it was nature, how much of it was nurture, but I think I developed this survival understanding very early that I had to stay out of her way. And so I would notice things from a very early age, like she wasn't a hugging, cuddling kind of mother. She was often very disparaging. I actually, it was when I was an adult that I discovered I was an intelligent person rather than an abused person. I knew that when I was very young. But my mother was, it's very typical for a female narcissist to isolate one child as their enemy, and to see other women, girls and women, as competitors. And in our case, because my father was better equipped, having taken care of his younger sister when she was born. There were 13 years between them. He was better equipped to take care of me when I was born. And there was, a real bond or something between my father and I that she saw as very threatening to her position in the family. And so I was that enemy child, and she tended to be just very, she would frequently tell me how worthless or, stupid. She used the word stupid all the time. I always seemed to be in her way. I always, seemed to be just undesirable. And I think that, because that was so obvious, so young, I could very easily see that when we were alone, she was one way. And when we had company over or she was around other people, she was a completely different person. Suddenly I was a child, and I, was doted on for 5 minutes until that person was out of the room. And then it was sort of back to what was normal. And I think one of the reasons that my grandmother was such a profound part of my life was because even in our culture, where some mild amount of excessive discipline or mild child abuse was sort of acceptable, she could see that I should not be left with my parents over the weekend when they weren't working. And she would take me to her apartment every weekend by hook or by crook, to make sure that I was, not underfoot. I was safe. I was loved. And I was cared for, and allowed to just be a kid, which I didn't always get to do at home. So yeah, it was all too obvious not to. It wasn't until I was 16 that I really could say or understand that what had been going on in my home all those years was abusive. But I knew that there was something not normal happening that was, there had to be a word
afoot,
for.
right? Well, first,
Yeah.
so many things. It's like Cinderella. Like, she was so jealous of you. She called you stupid, dumb, and a pig, whatever,
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet you're this beauty of your own being. And you also have a sibling, correct?
I do. I have one brother. He is almost 10 years younger than me. He was her darling, is her darling still. There was never a time that he ever did anything, wrong or punishable, or, like I never did anything rebellious. I didn't use drugs when I was younger. I didn't go out and party. I was always home on Friday nights so that I could clean one floor of the house while she cleaned the other floor of the house, and whereas my brother, he had a wild streak. And so, he was doing drugs and he was getting into all kinds of mischief, and still he was the golden child. And part of that is cultural, because that's kind of the case with Russians. The boys are always more wonderful than the girls. But part of it was the fact that in her mind, I think my brother filled this, void, this emotional void that she saw in her marriage. And she just plunked him right in there. And so she's put as much time and effort and unnatural attachment into creating her sort of perfect partner in life out of him. And that's left him a total mess. I mean, I love my brother. We're very close. And I think that, even though he was doted upon as a child, and I was, somewhat neglected as a child, and abused as a child, we both wound up. I mean, he is in some ways even more damaged than I was after all
Oh
is
my
said and
gosh.
done,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of mixed messaging there, like there's a lot. It's just everyone's experience of mistreatment is so personal, obviously, but also just so heavily packed with whatever their personal experience is. And I guess our experiences were just different. I had my grandmother until I was 22, and then she passed. And so I had her in my life my entire, like, during the most integral parts of my life. And so that comparison was always there, that there was, it was possible to be loved and accepted and fostered and encouraged by a dominant female figure in your life. And that was something that, and I would see it in my friends' mothers, I would see it in other relationships. I would see it in the way other women conducted themselves. And I don't think my brother ever really had a version of that in his own life. And so he's, nearly 37 and only just starting to kind of approach figuring all of that out.
That's a
And
lot.
starting
That's
to
a lot.
unpack it. It's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah. Yeah.
Adults who didn't have their emotions and their head
Yeah.
screwed on straight. It's not
Yeah.
a child's position to have to manage the
It's
parents as
not.
well.
Yeah.
I would like to hear more about your grandmother.
Yeah.
Which of the women, or both of these women in your life, do you want to give a name to?
So, I can name them both. My mother's name is Etya, and my grandmother's name was Beyla. Um, and it's funny, when my grandmother came to America a few years after we did, um, one of the greatest indignities of her life was that the American spelling of Beyla, which is, phonetically correct, is not phonetically correct in Russian, because the Y makes an oo sound. And so she was always so incredibly upset that they had written her name Beyula on her passport.
Oh dear.
um,
The
pronounce it
stories
that
at
way. So
at the passport office,
yeah,
whatever, at Ellis
exactly.
Island. So many
Right.
names were
Yeah,
changed because they didn't know how to write it. So they just, okay, you're in
absolutely.
America now, take it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I
Oh,
mean,
that's
they
funny.
spelled it correctly. It is in English. You would spell it that way in order for that A sound to come out of the E. Otherwise it's just Bella. So that did make sense to me, but it did not make sense at all to her, which was pretty entertaining throughout my life.
So
Um,
they come and they lived in Brooklyn with you guys as well?
Yeah, so it was just my grandmother. She came, let's see, we came in 70, I think we came at the end of 77. And I want to say she probably came maybe in, oh gosh, 79 or 80. I don't remember the exact year, to be completely honest. I know that it was a few years after we had arrived. And we were living in the projects in Brooklyn, as many immigrants did back then. And she moved in with us for a little while until she could get her own apartment in another, projects building in our neighborhood. We were all in Sheepshead Bay, and I do very distinctly remember the, like, full on, thank God no one had any actual weapons, knock down, drag out fights between my mother and my grandmother. My mother would just constantly be on my grandmother for something or other thing that was obviously, I'm sure, maybe not so obviously, but I would assume was a pretty minor infraction. But my grandmother would do everything. She would do the cooking, she would do the laundry, she would do the cleaning up, because she felt like my mother was out there working all day and my grandmother didn't have a green card yet, so she couldn't work. And, that was the least she could do if she got to stay in the apartment. And
So what kind of work did your mom do?
my mother worked in accounts receivables for the Guardian Life Insurance Company. which is now the W Hotel in Union Square.
How things change, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very funny. So
And
you're,
I think
go
she
ahead.
worked there for like 20 something years. It was a very long time. Yeah.
Wow. So now your grandmother, she was a seamstress in Russia. So I'm assuming she picked
Hmm.
this up when she came to Brooklyn.
Indeed. Yeah. So she was a seamstress in Russia. I don't know how she came by her skill set. I do know that she actually taught my grandfather to sew, which is how he became a tailor. Um, but she worked in, um, initially, she was working in this, like, dry cleaner, like little dry cleaners that had like like two industrial machines, like two little booths in the front window. And that's where she worked. And, she worked there for a long time, like a pretty long time until my brother was born. And then at some point, my mother, asked her to I think my parents paid her so that she would basically be like she would nanny my brother, at which point she switched over to doing she took on like private clients, like people would come to her house, to her apartment, and she would measure everything and do their repairs. And then
Your grandmother taught you how to sew.
yes, when she was working at this tailor shop, anytime I had off from school, I would wind up with her at the tailor shop. And I would basically spend my time like all, semi-latchkey children did back in the early 80s, running between the candy store on the corner, the tailor shop, and the laundromat next door where I had made a friend of whichever lady worked there. And I would sit at some point in my grandmother's little booth, at her side on the floor, like amongst all these little scraps. And she would take a piece of fabric and draw a flower on it and then hand me a needle and thread. And I would basically embroider tracing the drawing she did. And that was how I learned to stitch and how to learn. Like that turned into her teaching me how to make like a very, very basic shirt for a Barbie doll or whatever. And, it just kind of went on from there. And so I'd been hand sewing for years thanks to her. And then when she passed, she gave me her sewing machine, which she had earned her livelihood on, all the years that she'd been in America. And I had never used a sewing machine before. I was terrified. But I actually made the first thing I made on that machine were the ring bearer pillows for my first wedding, because my ex-husband and I both had brothers the same age, so each of our brothers carried the other person's ring.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made these two pillows using my grandmother's sewing machine. And then after that, that was it. I just felt like, I don't know if there was some sort of like holy ghost that I had caught by using the machine, but there was no stopping me, and that just started my love affair with all textiles and fibers and, fabrics, which led into knitting and, crochet. And then I drew a hard line at learning how to dye, spin,
I
because
can't imagine why.
I have
You're
enough.
pretty
I have
busy.
enough addictions. Yeah.
So
But
you
she taught me,
go ahead.
yeah. I was going to say she taught me to appreciate the beauty in the creative process and the beauty and the functionality of just basic, like, I mean, we have to wear clothing. That's what society, requires of us. And that clothing can be incredibly pragmatic and incredibly functional. And it can also be very, very detailed and very beautiful. But, between learning to love creating and learning compassion and kindness and, really how to be a mother, from her, and also learning, because we didn't even really talk about this, there's not enough time, but my grandmother had been a widow for most of her life, and she never even dated a man after that. And so she also taught me the incredible value of self-sufficiency. And so basic skills like sewing a button, which most of my oldest child's generation has no idea how to do, like, I value that. I teach my own children. I feel like someone's got to pass that stuff on, like I have three kids. They were all, assigned female at birth. And so I raised them to be strong women, for all intents and purposes. And they need to know all of it. They need to hang their own shelves. They need to darn their own holes. They need to cook their own meals. And I feel like all of that comes from having spent so much time with my grandmother in the time I had with her.
Oh, we all need just that one person, one individual who can see us for who we are.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing when my boys going through middle school and high school, and they go through tough times, and I say, you just need one friend that sees you for who you are.
Yeah.
And in this case, I know you sent me the one picture, and it's really beautiful of you and your grandmother. So I will cherish that one, and hopefully everyone else will be able to see that one as well as we get the social media graphic up and running. So Irina Lester, your store is called The Local Yarn Store. You've also made a conscious decision of choosing companies that are inclusive, they support the American wool industry, and they're fair to their employees.
Yeah, for sure. I can find the smaller brands. I can find the family-owned companies. I can support them and feel like I'm in my own tiny way making impact in the world, So yeah, I try really hard to make sure that I'm not bringing in anything that is exploitative in any way, or, supporting any kind of bias or, human invalidation of any kind.
That's important. The store is called The Local Yarn Store, and you can find it online at thelocalярnstore.com. Irina Lester, thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to share this story. I mean, this is like a 12-chapter book, I think, that you may have to yarn in one day when you'll yarn it out.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm Jackie Tantillo, and we will be back next week with another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother.